Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone in our audience, wherever you are in the world. I'm Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and I want to welcome all of you today to AGSIW's program, 20 years after the U.S. invasion, What is Next for Iraq? Now, it's easy to say that the invasion of Iraq has not aged well. Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was also the director of policy planning in the George W. Bush administration, said in 2016 that the Iraq war was a war that did not need to happen, and certainly not when it did. A Reuters headline that I saw yesterday was far less understated, and it was, U.S.-led Iraq war ushered in years of chaos and conflict. President Bush's decision to invade was controversial in the United States, condemned in much of the region and the world, and has led to a lot of changes. And as an American diplomat who spent half of the last decade living in Iraq, the war and its consequences are not just academic for me, they're quite personal. I think they're also personal for our participants today, as they are for Iraqis and for the many Americans who have, over the years, lived and worked in Iraq. From an American perspective, the invasion weakened Iraq as a state, but in fact, deposing Saddam Hussein and curbing the worst abuses of his regime was among the stated goals of the war, so that outcome is not unlikely. The invasion imposed a democratic system on Iraq, a system at least partially conceived of and written by Iraqis, but which has now become subject to manipulation by populism, corruption, sectarianism, and threats of violence. And the invasion expanded the scope of interference in Iraq from outside actors. There's an increased Turkish presence in the north. You have seen the rise of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and most prominently, the emergence of influential militias and political parties, in many cases linked to Iran. So those facts beg some very basic questions that I want to get to today. Why did the United States invade in 2003? Were the Bush administration's stated reasons the same as its underlying motivations? How did Iraqis, both inside and outside Iraq, react to the idea of deposing Saddam and also to the invasion itself? What did the United States and Iraq do wrong over the past 20 years? But also, did we do anything right in the past 20 years? Do Iraqis accept their democratic system? Can a state-run oil export system sustain Iraq's economy into the future, provide for Iraq's growing population, or cope with the challenges of climate change? Are there solutions to help deal with sectarianism, corruption, security, government inefficiency? And maybe most basically, what do Iraqis, particularly young Iraqis, want for their future? And we have assembled for you today a fantastic team of experts for the discussion. And let me introduce them briefly, but you can find their full bios on AGSIW's website. Dr. Marsin is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and a research fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Her research focuses on religion and politics in the Middle East, particularly civil society in Iraq, and it has appeared in numerous American, European, and Middle Eastern outlets. She holds a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree from Wellesley College. Dr. Alshamary, Marsin, welcome. Deborah Amos covers the Middle East for National Public Radio and earlier worked in television for both ABC and PBS. She is the recipient of numerous awards for her reporting, including in 2004, the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award for coverage of Iraq. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of 2 books on the Middle East. She teaches journalism at Princeton and holds a degree in broadcasting from the University of Florida at Gainesville. Ms. Amos, Deb, we're very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Dr. Abbas Kadhim leads the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. He has been a senior foreign policy fellow at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and taught at the Naval Postgraduate School and Stanford University. He's the author of several books on Iraq and the Middle East and earned his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Kadhim, Abbas, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Deb, I'd like to start the discussion with you. Can you lay out for us the reasons the U.S. invaded, what it hoped to accomplish, and kind of the process that led up to the invasion more than 20 years ago.
So let me first say this. I covered both 1991 and 2003. And 2003 was much different in terms of the atmosphere of Washington. It was a fevered time. It was post 9/11. We certainly had come not even close to recovery at that moment. And so that was the loud background of the decisions to go and invade Iraq. There were things written publicly. It was because of weapons of mass destruction. It was to stop Saddam and terrorism. It was to free the Iraqi people. But then you would have the U.S. Defense Secretary say, we needed to bomb something else to send the message to the Middle East that we couldn't be pushed around. I saw a very interesting statistic yesterday that I forgot about. And that is in 2003, 69% of Americans, reported the Washington Post, believed that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. We're used to this now of influencing campaigns. And, we saw it in the 2016 election and again in 2020, but we forget that there were more crude methods to do the same thing in 2002, 2003, whether people meant to do it or not. That's an extraordinary figure, 69%. And I think in 2003, most Americans supported the invasion because of the atmosphere created by the administration.
Abbas, can I ask you to pick up on that, but give us the Iraqi perspective? I know that there were a lot of Iraqis who were in Washington opposing Saddam Hussein. What role did Iraqis have in influencing the decision? And maybe take that a step farther. How did Iraqis react to the invasion when it actually happened in 2003?
Thank you, Ambassador, for organizing this timely event. It's an honor to be with this distinguished panel. To pick up from your questions on what you just mentioned here or spoke about, Iraqis did influence the decision, and there are more than one narrative about how they did that. The popular narrative that is claimed by or pushed by the Iraqis themselves, who were involved in facilitating the decision, and some Americans who were in the decision making, that it was the Iraqi role and request of U.S. administrations, successive administrations, that made that decision or facilitated it or played a large role in it. And another narrative, which also has probably equal credibility, is that the United States, the Bush administration, especially George W. Bush administration, did want to invade Iraq and change the regime. And it was nice to have Iraqis who were making that request and coming on record and popularly or publicly requesting that and endorsing the decision and even taking role in the aftermath. So whether it is this or that, I think there was no question that the regime of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party rule needed to end in order to deliver Iraq from the 35-year ordeal that Iraq was going through and Iraqis were living through. And there seemed to be no end in sight except for some military action to end that regime. Now, as to your question on the reaction of Iraqis, you served in Baghdad, and Iraqis. There is, really always Iraqis are known for a very diverse opinion, not given the background of Iraqis, but given the time of the day. So it is important. It's sometimes the position of an Iraqi is not by what they stand for, but where everyone else stands for, and that's important, or where everyone else stands. But in general, we could say that Iraqis were torn between pride and the pragmatism towards a necessity. Removing Saddam Hussein's regime, as I said, was a necessity to end the torturous rule. He led also the sanctions that were really bringing Iraqis down to their knees in terms of their economic life and their social life, and even their social fabric itself was torn apart. But also there was the removing Saddam Hussein's at the hands of or by a U.S. invasion, by a foreign invasion, not necessarily even a U.S., was hurtful to the national pride of Iraqis. As a veteran of the 1991 uprising, I did participate in that uprising. We hoped to remove Saddam Hussein after the liberation of Kuwait, and that participation cost me 11 years in exile, followed by 20 years of living abroad by choice or the necessity of the reality of life. You know, there are millions of Iraqis, actually, literally millions, who are living out of Iraq, who appreciate what it meant for this. So yes, there was this mixed feeling or blurred feeling that, okay, well, you want Saddam Hussein's regime to go, but also you didn't want it to be with the cost of an occupation and really having the country in the hands of a foreign power that Iraqis had a long history that was not good with the United States, especially, again, the 1991 history was very injurious for the Iraqis. Also, the sanctions gave the U.S. a bad reputation because it was the spearhead of arguably one of the most, if not the most, corrupt program that the UN ever administered in any country, the oil for food program. But one other thing, if I may take a few seconds to mention, is the Iraqi opposition groups, and that's an important. I think we would separate it from the general Iraqi view, and that is, some of them, of course, were there, like people like Ahmed Chalabi and the National Conference. They were on the record. They were hands and glove and with the U.S. administration. Among the Islamist groups, I think the Islamic Supreme Council for Revolution in Iraq, which is led by the late Grand Ayatollah Mohammed al-Hakim, signed on from the beginning, and Sayyid Abdulaziz al-Hakim came to Washington and basically endorsed the change. But other opposition groups, either opportunistically or because of their political ideologies, did oppose that, like the Da'wah Party. However, when the invasion took place, of course, everybody jumped on the bandwagon, some of them by claiming that, okay, the invasion is done, or others, they said that this is our only way to take Iraq back from a foreign occupation. But everybody did participate, with an exception of the Sadrist movement, not because they didn't want to participate, but the U.S. made a decision not to include them and decided to work with people they knew and they worked with from the opposition, and they were not known for the U.S. And I think this is one of the bad mistakes that took place early on. And some Iraqis were neutral because, as I said, this pragmatism, like the Marja'iyya in Najaf was a major force in Iraq, and they decided to keep silent. And I wrote about that in the past. They did well because they took a hard lesson from what happened to Iraq with the British invasion in 1914 and thereafter. And they noticed that their participation cost them and the Shia community in Iraq a lot of pain. So this time they said, we will wait out and see how the process unfolds, and if it is at the end not hurtful for the Shia community or the Iraqi community at large, we will maintain our silence. If we see something else, there is always time to come in and then correct the situation.
Marsin, I want to go to you next, because half of what Abbas just said is that the Iraqis who understood and favored the removal of Saddam Hussein remembered the horrors of Saddam's regime. But for younger Iraqis who did not live and experience Saddam, Is the impression of 2003 and the events any different than from what Abbas has just laid out? And maybe for other communities of Iraqis other than Iraqi Shia?
Thank you, Ambassador Silliman, for the invitation to speak on this really important topic today. I'll start with a small anecdote that I actually wrote about in War on the Rocks, I think in about 2018, which I was doing research on Islamist opposition parties, particularly Shia ones in Iraq, as well as religious leaders. And I had an Iraqi research assistant who was maybe 17, who was attending these meetings with me. And we'd attended a meeting with a very high level member of an Islamist party who was also a cleric. And I was asking him about the 70s and 80s, and he was recounting these tales of extreme repression by the Ba'athist regime. And once the conversation was over and we had left, my research assistant looked very incredulous. He said to me, were they really as bad as this guy makes them sound to be? He couldn't believe that there was this level of repression that had happened in Iraq prior to 2003. And this for me is really a reminder, and I think it's a lesson for everyone, that historical memory is so short. You can't expect people to remember what happened, not even 10 years ago, much less, 2 decades ago. And so when I look at Iraq today, I've been living in Baghdad for 2 years now. And prior to that, I've traveled to the country multiple times a year. The majority of Iraqis are, born after 2003, and the vast majority of them were either, hadn't even been born in the invasion or had been very young when the invasion happened. Their memory of Baathism and of living under totalitarianism comes entirely either inherited from their families, whatever experience they had, or from like a selective perusal of whatever is on social media these days. And, this changes, so it gives them different views of what Saddam Hussein's regime was like. When it comes to the actual invasion and the occupation, they have very little memory of that, but they do contend with the legacies of that invasion in specific ways. So whereas they don't remember necessarily like the Americans being on the streets or anything like that, they do remember and are impacted by things that happened as a result of the American-led war, which is the sectarian lens that was imposed on Iraq and that really defined the way governance was structured after. This led to waves of sectarian violence in 2005 and onwards. And the 2005 civil war was quite formative for so many Iraqis of my generation and the generations younger than me, so that it's led to this very strong and passionate anti-sectarian turn in Iraq that you see today, where it's considered wrong and it's considered to be disrespectful to look at sect. At the same time, this isn't really manifested yet into something that's very inclusive in governance. So it's really been more of a Shia-Sunni reconciliation on a younger level and an understanding of one another. You see that Kurdish youth, for example, are more distant than ever from their co-nationals in the other parts of Iraq. And you see there's like very little knowledge or understanding of the plight of minority communities. So the Sunni Shia reconciliation, particularly among youth, is a wonderful development in post-2003 Iraq, and particularly in the last few years, but it hasn't yet translated into more of a civic culture. But I'm hopeful that this continues. The other legacy of the invasion that they do contend with, even if they don't associate it directly with the invasion and occupation, is this negative association of consociationalism with poor governance and corruption. And this is very closely tied to sectarianism. So that's what the remnants of it are. But I think if you ask them about democracy, there's mixed evidence as to what they feel about it. On one hand, there is this authoritarian nostalgia. They don't have memory of the Ba'ath, so they compare to an ideal of a strong state, of a state in which the army was able to maintain sovereignty, in which there weren't incursions from Iran and Turkey every other day, in which there were jobs, and in which Iraq had a respected position in the Middle East. I think that's what they're nostalgic for. They compare themselves to their peers in countries that they view as similar, which is mainly oil exporting countries. And they express a strong man nostalgia because they think that that will bring socioeconomic rights. And I think what this shows is at the end of the day, where Iraqi youth are where a lot of youth in the Middle East are, which is they thought that democracy would deliver socioeconomic rights. And when it failed to do so, they didn't feel that they were strongly attached to democracy. Now, I can complicate this narrative of democracy and whether or not they want it and the protests. But I'll pause here and then we can probably talk about it as we move consecutively to other parts of Iraq's history.
Martin, thank you very much. We've got some very good questions already. So let me bring some of the questions in from the audience. I'm going to make an exception and open the microphone for Ambassador Frank Wisner, the chair of the board of AGSIW, to speak to the group. So Frank, in theory, you now have a live mic.
Actually, I have a historical question. In the presentation by your first speaker on the history of the American engagement, you did not emphasize the sentiment of the day that I recall so strongly, and that is the nuclear issue. There was a lively play in Washington that we were facing a serious nuclear problem from Iraq. While we all know that that was exaggerated and used as a reason to go to war, nonetheless, it's my memory, and what I want to ask you is that Saddam fed that ambiguity. He didn't disavow a nuclear fear. I've always assumed because he wanted to use it as a defense against Iran. Am I wrong in my assumption? Why did the nuclear issue, why was it not more forcefully rebutted by the Saddam regime?
Frank, thank you very much for that. Abbas, maybe I should ask you to take on that question. How do you characterize the way Saddam Hussein's regime was looking at things like nuclear weapons?
Thank you. I don't believe that Saddam Hussein managed that crisis well, but in fairness to history, the Iraqis did everything in their power to deliver any evidence that was needed by the UN committees and delegations. And thousands of pages were given that Iraq did not have, not just nuclear, the claim was more. It was WMDs in general. So that means chemical and biological, etc. And Iraq did deliver hundreds of thousands of pages, if not more, on this for year after year. But also, I think where Saddam Hussein's regime was foolish is that they wanted, in the meantime, to maintain what was described accurately as ambiguity, hoping that it would serve as a deterrence. That, yes, we are complying, but who knows? We are holding one card, somewhere that you don't know what it is. But saying that, oh, we don't have anything. And I think that ambiguity not, caused sincere fear in the hearts of those who wanted to invade Iraq, but they gave them a pretext.
Yeah. Let me go to some of the questions. There are a couple that go back, Deb, to what you were talking about. I would also say, adding to Ambassador Wisner's comment, there was a lot of discussion about chemical weapons. Colin Powell went to the United Nations very famously, which he later recanted, with an argument that, in fact, the horrors of Halabja in 1988 could again be repeated inside Iraq, and that was another reason for the invasion. Two related questions from the audience. One from Charles, asking why are we not mentioning the State Department's The Future of Iraq project, which was actually, I had a very small part in this from my perch in Amman, Jordan. And it was, why was it simply shelved after the invasion? Deb, I don't know if you can talk to that with your discussions in the military, the administration at the time, but a lot of work went into it, how you could structure a post-invasion outcome that would be less destructive of Iraq and would theoretically be more pragmatic. Also, a question from Emil Nakle saying that sort of the Bush administration in 2022 or 2002, 2003 had already decided to invade. The push by some Iraqis and some Arab regimes to do the regime change really influenced the administration. Again, I will start by saying I was in Amman when Dick Cheney and Tommy Franks and various other senior people came through in 2002, well before the invasion in early 2003. And I think that there was a discussion with at least the government in Jordan of how this was going to happen more than whether or not it was a good idea. So I think, and Deb, you probably remember more Washington or senior DOD conversations at the same time to kind of shed light on those two ideas.
So let me go to Emil's question first, and that is, I do question whether Iraqis pushed the Bush administration over the finish line. I don't think so. Although, years later, I discovered that there were two Iraqis in the White House on the eve of the invasion. One of them was Kanan Makia, and I remember him telling me distressfully that on that evening, the president looked at him and said, "I understand there are two kinds of Muslims, Sunnis and Shia." And it was the first time that he understood this was not going to go well, because he understood that this was the first time that the president had sort of comprehended this divide. And it wasn't a great time to sort of learn these lessons. So I can see why the argument that it wasn't the Iraqis is correct. The second thing is this notion that they threw away the plans. It is the moment to address, the de-Baathification and the, decommissioning the Iraqi military. Whose idea was that? It's still unclear to me who exactly signed that order. Was it Bremer by himself? He is officially the one who signed the order, but where did that come from? It was the most disastrous decision that was made in those early days, and it probably set the tone for the next couple of years. So I have no insight into why those plans were thrown away, but they were.
Well, I think this is a good segue into the second part of our conversation, which begins essentially, what were the mistakes that were made over the course of the occupation by Americans, by Iraqis, and maybe a little bit about what might have gone right. I will say that when I was in Baghdad in 2011, one of my most interesting tasks was, after all U.S. combat forces had left in early 2012, I took the cardboard banker's box of Coalition Provisional Authority orders, the actual originals with the original signatures, to the foreign ministry and gave them from the occupying power to the new government of Iraq. Kind of a strange diplomatic role. But it was interesting to look through those documents to see that the things that had been made, the influence of what those decisions from 2003 and 2004 had on the country. So maybe let me go to Marsin first, because you talked a little bit about democracy, the process of drafting a constitution, and the process came out of this idea of building a new and different Iraq for the future. So what do you see in that period, certainly of the U.S. occupation through 2011 and later, that the United States did wrong or badly, and what were the implications of that?
This has come to mind now because of what Iraq is going through today, which is dealing a lot with corruption. But I was reflecting a lot on my experience talking to Iraqi civil society, as well as local staff who had worked for the provincial reconstruction teams and for various American projects and teams in the early aftermath of the war. And I think the US is a lot more complicit in creating corruption and fostering it in Iraq than it ever lets on. And I think we're living in a country today, Iraqis are, that could have been a lot less corrupt had some practices not been instilled in the first place. I mean, you're entering a country in which everyone has just exited brutal sanctions, in which the social contract was decimated and money was being thrown around everywhere, and with very little oversight from what I hear from local Iraqis who are working as middlemen between the occupying powers and local organizations. I specifically do research on civil society, and they tell me stories about how easy it was to get their hands on so much money to start what amounted to ghost organizations that did absolutely nothing. Iraq went from 0 to 100 in terms of money thrown towards things so quickly that it really it created this culture of corruption that continues with us today. And corruption is very cancerous, very difficult to get rid of as it gets stronger. And it's very much entrenched in the country today. And the reason this was coming to mind as I was reflecting over what to say is because the United States is putting so much pressure on Iraq right now to transform its banking system and to stop money leaking into actual cash leaking into Iran and into Turkey and into Syria. But we forget that the reason that Iraq even has this, banking infrastructure that's very poor and these dollar auctions that are a very easy way to launder money is because of American policies. And, if as I was reflecting on decisions, everyone focuses on de-Baathification and on the hasty and inclusive constitution writing. And I agree with those. I'm not an expert on them, but the one that's on my mind today is we could have been in a much better place today had there been more foresight into what corruption could manifest into 20 years down the line.
And Deb, let me ask you that's a similar question, but I also want you to take on the last question from section 1 from our audience, because I think you are probably best placed for this, from Barak Schreiber. Why did President George H.W. Bush not continue to liberate Iraq after he liberated Kuwait? In other words, the uprising that Abbas spoke about in 1991, what were the motivations, even though the president had called for an uprising against Saddam at that point?
He did. I was in Kuwait when that happened, when there was the original call for people to rise up. And I didn't get to Basra and to meet the people who did that for many years afterwards, after 2003. But I did meet them. And many of them said to me, look, we know it was our mistake. Because what happened is Iraqis who were in Iran arrived with big posters of Khomeini. There was a group that were way too pro-Iran, and I think that the support in the rest of it began to fade away because of that. And they knew that was a mistake. And it took me many years to think about that. I think the idea about reflecting back, it's funny, since I've been asked to be on this panel, I have been, because I spent so much of my life in these moments that remain as anecdotes. And that meeting with the Basra uprising people was very instructive for me about what actually happened on the ground. And they knew that it was a mistake.
And a specific question also for you, Deb. Who was the second Iraqi in the White House besides Kanan Makia on the eve of the invasion? Do you recall?
Yeah, Ren Frankie.
Oh.
If I may say something, Ambassador.
Please about, yeah. I was going to move to you next.
Your first question of why they did not go ahead and topple Saddam Hussein. I think for that, we have a statement on the record by the then Secretary of State, Jim Baker. And he did write in one of his books, and I quoted it in one of my articles. He said, as much as they liked to see him gone, some of Saddam Hussein's neighbors were fearful that any change, political change in Iraq would play into the hands of the mullahs of Iran. So, and therefore they pressured the United States not to change the regime. That was one. What he didn't say also, of course, the US was going with a coalition. Some of the members in the coalition were not interested in toppling Saddam Hussein, like the French and others. And the US did not want to go it alone. The US pride at the time was that it was a 30-country coalition of a willing that the president put by then in 91. And a third possible thing, which is actually, there is a lot of evidence in it and the after narratives, is that the US never won a war, real war, after the World War II. And that was the first real win. And the president in his speech to Congress mentioned that it was, the Vietnam syndrome was over and we won. So they wanted to cultivate that victory, and instead of going into Iraq and jeopardizing the entire process by going into a war that they didn't know if they would ever cultivate as a victory. But I think the influence of the Gulf states, Saudi in particular, that was the host of the coalition, made the difference. And let's remember that I'm not here blaming anyone. That was 91, so just 2 years after the passing of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini. Iran at the time was different than the Iran of Rafsanjani and others when it became moderated. So the fear was there.
Well, and I'll also note that the difference between 1991 and 2003 is that in 1991, there was a very specific UN mandate for the use of force. And George Bush went up to the edge of that mandate and then stopped. And that was the sort of legal and public justification for not continuing. Although I know that is recently, for me, as 2012 and 2013, I have had some Iraqi friends from the South ask me if the United States was ever going to apologize for encouraging, but then not supporting an uprising against Saddam. So I know that this feeling, bad feeling perhaps, against what was not done in 1991 lived on for a couple of decades.
My grandsons will get that apology, hopefully.
Abbas, let me stay with you. And if you can give us, again, one thing that you think was done badly by the Americans or the Iraqis during the period between 2003 and today, and what that impact might be today.
Well, that's a great question. If you and I would sit and count the books that were written about the mistakes, we would probably take the rest of the time of this great panel. But I would suggest something that has not been talked a lot about. I think, if ever, I haven't heard it certainly. The U.S. had too many co-pilots, I think, in that one. First, they felt the Bush administration felt that they lacked mandate or legitimacy on the international stage. Everybody from the UN to key allies, except for the British, did not want to go along, and the U.S. administration took matters into their own hands. There was no, even inside the United States and elsewhere around the world, popularly, there was an opposition to this. So they felt that they needed any confirmation from anybody, and that's why they allowed many actors to have their own spheres of influence. And then a lot of damage was done. The Saudis had their sphere of influence in Iraq. The Iranians had their sphere of influence. And not by the Saudis, I'm talking even also by extension, the Gulf states. Some of the other powers also had this. And Iraqis were also put too soon as co-pilots into this. The U.S. Became an occupation, wrote the language to the UN resolution that called itself an occupation, but didn't act like an occupation. And at the end of the day, no one was in charge. And that was a huge mistake. I think the US administration focused more on winning hearts and minds than doing the process right and doing the right thing. And at the end of the day, they did not win the hearts and minds, and they did not do anything right in the making of that. Had the United States acted like an occupying force in the way those old occupations have done, let everybody sit aside and then make the entire process, as they envisioned it, and then take responsibility for the mistakes and credit for the right things, that would have been the right way to do. Now, probably, and I know that you, in our back talks, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about some good things, and there are a lot. I think we are more conducive in our work to talk about. Also, there are so many good things, evidently, that happened after the invasion. But in my mind, this was the original sin: is that the United States did not do it as an occupation. They just took the bad reputation of an occupier without giving themselves the chance to vindicate themselves later by leaving a good product after the occupation. So it was a sad decision or set of decisions that led us to suffer as the United States, but also more suffering on the Iraqi people that they are living with until today.
So I want to go, Deb, next to you to sort of take up Abbas's challenge. Can you name one thing that turned out right from this entire process over the past 20 years? And Marsin and Abbas, I'll come back quickly to you on this point as well.
Sure.
Kurdistan, I mean, they did well. They had 10 years start on everybody else in terms of governance and had more time after the invasion to build up their institutions in ways that Baghdad was too busy with turmoil and chaos to be able to do. So I would say that is a big one. And I suppose you could argue that this generation did not have to go through the way that the regime behaved and have grown up with a different mindset than their parents and grandparents. Those are rather vague in terms of the good news, but there you are.
Marsin, do you have anything that you can say turned out positively from this experience?
I mean, I'm an optimist and I'm very optimistic about Iraq's future, but that's part of being Iraqi and having no choice but to be positive about the future. I will say that I do agree with Deb about an entirely different language that developed in Iraq after 2003. And I say this as one of the few people in Iraq, I'll be one of the older youth cohorts. So people of my generation remember a little bit of what Baathism was like. And I do have a strong memory of extreme self-policing. And I do notice the differences in how older generations think of the state and think of authority, and how younger generations perceive the state and perceive authority. And I'm very struck by the fact that Iraqis who choose to boycott elections in the last two rounds, I mean, whether or not you agree with boycott, the fact is that they believe that by boycotting, they delegitimize. I think is such a change in mentality from other generations that it is a positive development in Iraq. And so I would point to that.
Okay. And Abbas, I will give you the opportunity to give us a good outcome other than the departure of Saddam Hussein.
No, the departure of Saddam Hussein was a no-brainer from the beginning, but clearly I think there are other things. If we look at the trajectory of where Iraq has been between 2003 until today, Iraq today stands in a very healthy position as opposed to where it would have been had Saddam stayed or had the process unfolded in a different way, a military coup or something. That would be definitely the case. Iraqis, we have to always remind ourselves that they are still believing in the system they have. They loathe their politicians, their political class. They have many complaints about so many problems that are with the implementation or that are done under the system, but not the system itself. So that is important. Iraq probably is the only Arab country right now that runs credible elections on time. People are elected and represent their constituents. The Iraqi standard of living, a professor in Iraq was making $3 a month during Saddam Hussein's time, and it would have been even worse. Today, Iraqis are making literally 1,000 times more than that. Iraq is reintegrated into the world after it was a pariah state where not just the regime, but the Iraqi himself was cast aside as not worthy of being someone who the world would associate with. Today, the Iraqis are doing very well as a society in that sense. But of course, I think when we argue about the good and bad of what Iraq, I think we always are disheartened by the loss of the potential. Iraq could be in a much better place today had the people who were in charge of running the country been more decent. But I believe that if we were to compare Iraq today with Iraq of Saddam Hussein, or what it had to go after, if not the invasion and its regime change and the system that was implemented, there is nobody with any marbles would really claim that Iraq is worse off today. So the positive is really in the trajectory. The positive is that Iraq has a future. Iraq under Saddam Hussein was a stagnant, poisoned pool, and that there was nowhere to go except for being more poisonous. This invasion and regime change had opened two ends to this, where new water came in, and it takes a long time to cleanse that poison, and there is no shortcut for democratization process, as you well know. All the people on the panel here are expert in this business of watching how these transitions went. Many countries historically and even today have gone through all of that pain and gave all the sacrifices and ended up nowhere or going to square one. Iraq is really today on an upward trajectory. And if we were to look at Iraq and compare it with the closest reference point, look what Afghanistan has done and look at. So I believe that Iraq has a good story and it will continue to improve on that story. But, probably the generations that are caught into it right now are not going to see or reap the benefits. But just like Marsin, I believe that Iraq has nowhere to go but to a better place. And it's because of that change.
Okay, as you sort of raised this, the question of sort of democracy, where it's going, one of our, an anonymous attendee would like a comment on the fact that the 2005 elections, which the United States and Iraqis accepted, brought to the fore more Islamist candidates than sort of pro-American secular candidates, the people that the Bush administration wanted. Has that had an enduring impact on, for example, the 2010 result and the ability of Nouri al-Maliki to overcome Alawi's initial electoral? And again, maybe, Marsin, is this part of the origin of the sectarianism that is now much more ingrained in the system, or was this election result because of sectarianism that was somehow built into the Constitution?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if Dr. Abbas was going to tackle the first part or I was. So I think that was a very important decision to respect the outcome of the Iraqi elections. I think it allowed for the natural progress of Iraqi public opinion, which we've seen waves of. So we saw an initial wave of acceptance of Islamists and of voting by identity, which I remember in 2005 and 10 that there was a strong inclination towards that. And then we saw a natural shift once having experienced what identity-based politics delivers towards demanding other forms of representation and of governance. And I think it was important to have the precedent of respecting the outcome of the election and taking on a figure that that certain sides found problematic in order to signal to Iraq that Iraq's decisions would be respected. Now, what I think is quite ironic about the United States is that it did that at one point, and yet its policy since then has been, we want democracy in Iraq, but we want a very specific kind of democracy in Iraq. We want a Shia majority country that doesn't want to have anything to do with Iran and that will criticize Iran and just stand completely with us. And I'm an exaggeration of US policy, but the signals it sends Iraqis are not very clear. It's not clear whether they truly want a democratic Iraq anymore, because sometimes it just sounds like they want an ally against the primary nemesis of the United States, which is Iran, of course. So that was a good precedent, but since then, I think US policy has fallen off the mark. And I think it shows little trust in Iraqi society's natural balance towards own self-preservation, which I think it understands better than everyone else. And I think we saw a lot of that in protest movements, in the way that youth organize, and in the way that elections are reacted to and participated in.
So, Abbas, do you have any comment on that question, the 2005 election, sectarianism, and the legitimacy of democracy in Iraq?
Well, I agree with Marsin. I believe she addressed it really well, as always. But as I say here and always, is Iraqis needed that time and space to manifest their own real political orientation. And let's face it, that the way Iraq's history, at least if we were to go with the nation state history from 1920 all the way to the time change until today, there was a battle of among the various ethno-sectarian groups that ended up most of the time with an oppression of everybody who was not in power. There was so much of exclusionism and exclusive politics in Iraq, and there was no culture of power sharing, of popular participation. Always people are two categories: those who are in power and those who are doing what they are told. So by the time we had that floodgate opened to Iraqis' emotions, they went to what is indigenous to their own political orientation, which is really their ethno-sectarianism. It is not just the Islamist groups, but also, I mean, in Kurdistan, nationalism or ethnic politics played themselves into the full extent, and sometimes even against common sense. And until now, they are happening. Same thing in the same way. The on the other side with the Shia and Sunni politics. So I think everybody was drawing from that bad, nasty history that they had of, in the book that I wrote about the founding of the state. I explained the history of the Iraqi nation state in the past century as really an ethno-sectarian struggle, and it's not really a struggle of Bedouinism versus urbanism, as Ali al-Wardi said, or it will not be explained by some Western theories that as Falih Abdul-Jabbar and others have put together. It is really that from the very beginning, Iraqis organized themselves politically on an ethno-sectarian setting, and still, when they had the freedom for the first time to choose, they went to what they knew. And this is not unique to Iraq. I mean, many other countries had that, and it takes a lot of learning, and it takes also a lot of practice and trial and error until they discover that there is a better way to do it than just go in a lazy way to resort to their ethno-sectarian comfort zones to pick their candidates, and finally look at this as a more of a pragmatic cost-benefit analysis of where you put your vote, and also. Again, Iraqis have received a lot of manipulation by many forces, including the political class, that appealed to their ethno-sectarian emotions and fears as well. But I think we are seeing changes now. Since 2019, the national debate has changed. As Marsin probably would say, she is on the ground and she sees the new generation. A lot of people are looking for transcending those ethno-sectarian affinities and going more towards a nationalist affinity that we hope to see nurtured and developed once it's given a chance.
Yeah, Deb, let's go to you. And if you could also expand a little bit for one of our audience members on how you see Kurdistan evolving differently or separately from the rest of Iraq. You mentioned that in your earlier statement. So you think either of those two topics you'd prefer? Okay,
I'm going to start with elections, and I'm going to punt on Kurdistan because I haven't been there in quite a while. But let me say something about 2005. That first election was a census more than it was an election. I mean, you're right that there needs to be a learning curve. You just don't walk into democracy the first time and get that right. Everybody dressed up in their Friday best, took their kids. It was a historic moment, but it was a census. Shia voted for Shia, Sunnis voted for Sunnis, Kurds voted for Kurds. That's how it worked. And there were two places that you could have political talk. One was the mosque. And this goes to another mistake that the Americans made, which is it was the Pentagon who shaped Iraqi media after the invasion. It had happened in the past in these transitions that NGOs would come and help a country sort of create a new media ecosystem. That didn't happen. And so what happened instead was the American military, who had no experience in doing this, set up a media system that became incredibly sectarian. They created a state television, but what it allowed for is all these other private companies to set up. So you had, 3 Kurdish channels, 4 Shia channels, a big booming Sunni channel, and they also could influence that first vote and did for a while until Iraqis had some experience in not voting for people because they spoke the best Arabic, but voting for people because it reflected what they needed. And it took a while for that to happen. It was very interesting to watch 2005 and see that, this is not easy. It's not as easy as it looks. You don't just show up at the polling place.
Well, I'm looking at the clock and we only have about a half an hour left, and I want to move to look at the future a bit because I want to make sure that we can draw some lessons from the successes and mistakes of the past 20 years. So Marsin, if I could ask you to set the stage for us, what do you see as the main aspirations of the coming generation of Iraqis? What is most important for them in governance? How important is democracy? And what does Iraq need to do? And to some extent, what does the United States need to do to help Iraq to the extent that we still have influence in these issues?
A really big question to which
Yes.
I've been prepared for. So, 20th anniversary, I've been writing a lot and reflecting on democracy. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my thoughts. What Iraqis want today is financial prosperity and good services. They want education, they want healthcare, they want electricity, paved roads, clean streets, etc. I think it's very clear. What they really don't want is they don't want a continuation of high levels of corruption that they see in the Iraqi state today, and they see these things as being associated. I think the question that I'm always interested in is how healthy is democracy as an idea in Iraq today? Not how healthy is the Iraqi democratic system or democratizing system. And if you'll allow me to share some public opinion polling, because I always go to that to check against what I see in the street, because I'm cognizant of where I live in Baghdad might not be reflective of the entire country. But I notice this very interesting duality and countervailing opinions about what democracy is that exist within the Iraqi street. And to give you an example of what this looks like, in the latest Arab barometer, 72% of surveyed Iraqis either agreed or strongly agreed that economic performance is weak under a democratic system. And 72% of them also agreed or strongly agreed that democratic regimes are indecisive and full of problems. And 70% of them agreed or strongly agreed that democratic systems are not effective at maintaining order and stability. So I asked myself, why are Iraqis so negative on democracy if at the same time a lot of them will tell you that Iraq is a sham democracy or a nominal democracy, it's not a true democracy. And yet I think implicitly they do measure Iraq as a democracy that has performed very poorly. And perversely, that actually gives me a bit of hope as to how willing Iraqis are to continue experimenting with democracy. And in the same poll, when asked, 69% of them will say that democratic systems have problems but are better than other systems. To me, this signals that the project is not yet dead, though it is under severe pressure. And I did notice that one of the questions in the Q&A was to really assess the health of democracy today. I do think Iraq had some strong democratic institutions that have begun to decay. We haven't lost them entirely, but I think there needs to be energy into making sure we don't lose them further. a lot of people ask me, what's the point? There's this collusive, pernicious political class that always ends up, whether or not they win elections, being heads of political parties and siphoning, millions off the state. My answer to this is I see only two paths for Iraq. If we want to upend the entire system, we're going towards a civil war, to which we know will last at least a decade. If we don't want to upend the system, we have to work with what we have, which is not great, but a lot better than our neighbors. So, we have elections that occur regularly and that are not free and fair in the most perfect sense of the word. There's so many irregularities, there's pre-electoral manipulation, but there is energy from the international community to work on them. There's energy from the United States to continue working on them. And I think it's important that Iraqis still see them as an institution. In addition to that, something that truly alarms me is that freedom of speech in Iraq was quite healthy after 2003 and started declining to a point today. I think that it actually has, I still think Iraq is a better place to be than most states in the region in terms of expressing yourself against political elite. I still feel much more comfortable in Iraq talking about politicians than I would ever do in other countries in the Middle East. But I think it is not where we want to be, and it's not where we were. And I would say under the prior administration of Mustafa al-Kadhimi, it did take a decline due to the use of Ba'ath-era laws to prosecute people. And sadly, the administration of Sudani hasn't gone back on this as well. It's continued down this path. And I think it's very easy to erode democratic institutions and much, much more difficult to build them. So my hope is that Iraq's friends and allies don't lose hope in the ability of Iraq to move past difficult moments and move past what I know seems insurmountable odds, only because I do think we are slightly better positioned than a lot of other countries in the region. And I know it's not a very high bar of comparison, but the alternative is, very ugly. The alternative is violence. And at this point, I look at Iraq and, Baghdad's quite stable. It's the safest it's been in years. I have friends who are American who come and visit me now. And, that was unthinkable before. And stability brings prosperity with it. It's a long journey, but I hope that Iraqis get help when it comes to rebuilding and continued support for democratic institutions that may decay.
Abbas, I wanted you to take a play off of what Marsin just said with a comment injected from one of our audience members who says, democracy in Iraq is facing big threats from radical Islamist parties and armed groups. Is that the threat to democracy in Iraq? Or if democracy is going to be strengthened, what needs to happen to the system to make it work better for Iraqis?
It's one of the threats. You don't want armed groups going around unfettered and without state control, that's for sure. Marsin just mentioned earlier about the issues with freedom of speech. And the consequences of speech in Iraq. Ironically, the consequences of speech in Iraq are not coming, the negative consequences or retribution, retaliation is not coming from the government. Today you can talk and you are 100% sure that the government's not going to do anything to you, but mostly it is the 1,000 other entities that will come and the government is standing by, is not able to protect freedom of speech. And that's the problem, but not that the government is putting people in jail for what they say. And yes, at the end of the day, for the speaker, it is the same. You are going to be hurt probably even more. You could always watch what you say if it is one party that you don't want to offend, but if it's whatever you say might offend somebody, that's a problem. But I think this is one of the threats in Iraq, which is armed groups. But also there are, the lack of rule of law, which is really goes to the crux of what we say here, is a problem for Iraq. Iraq needs a decent level of rule of law And that would ensure accountability. That would ensure also protection of people against the encroachments of freelancers here and there in society. That's a problem. And I think that we have, it's fashionable and of course popular to go after these groups because, again, the narrative is set in a way, and let's face it, again, I think it's the setting is right there for it. But I think it's lazy just by some people that we read for all the time that are reductionist in their approach, and they talk only about this problem, but there are many other problems. One of the biggest problems and that is basically, for example, Deb just mentioned Kurdistan and, all of the good stories about Kurdistan. I think Kurdistan is both what is good about Iraq and what is bad about Iraq. Kurdistan destroyed the idea of federalism in Iraq. We will never have federalism as long as Kurdistan is run the way that is, with complicity from pretty much every country that deals with Iraq. Kurdistan is a country where there is the constitution doesn't apply there. Even their own constitution doesn't apply when it comes to the way the government is run and all of that. Kurdistan has so many other problems. But on the other hand, it really has great stability. It has good security. It has some development and all of that. It's, depends on which time of the day you are, how you are feeling about it. There are so many criticisms. Don't listen to Abbas because maybe, but listen to the Kurds themselves, including leaders in Kurdistan. Kurdistan right now, just like the other parts of the country, in the old days, our biggest fear in Iraq was that ethno-sectarian conflict, literally, between the Shia, Sunnis, and Kurds. Now we have a more dangerous, more micro kind of conflict that is happening, which is Kurdish, Shia, Sunni, and that tends to be nastier and more dangerous and more lethal because you are fighting for the soul of the group you claim to represent, and you see in those. So I think, right now in my lifetime, even under the days of pre-2003, I have never seen Iraq uses this venomous rhetoric among the groups where people are using dehumanizing language that we only read about in the examples that led to wide civil wars and genocide, social genocide, if it continues to be unchecked. Within the groups, we talk about people right now who are literally not standing each other because of political differences or because of the whims of leaders within the group, not among the groups. So, and when it is within the group, you don't have a protection as a citizen. You could easily have a protection as a Shia if you are afraid of the Sunnis, or the Sunni afraid of the Shia, Kurdish afraid of the Arabs, etc. But when it is within the group, these are the people who are your next door neighbors, and there is no government there that would stand between you. So I think the militias is just one of those problems, and I believe that there are so many threats that slip by and go through the cracks of the system because speaking about them do not really feed into bigger ideologies in the debates, especially outside Iraq. It's, let's face it, all of these militia talks is just because of the accusation that they are close to Iran. If it is not that factor, nobody is bothered. There are many militias that are not close to Iran. Nobody is even mentioning them. There is also this armed conflict among tribes, which is nastier and more lethal on daily basis in Basra and Diyala and other places, because it is not that politically charged. You don't see it talked about, and I think it deserves full attention from Iraq and people who care about Iraq outside and inside Iraq. So, again, we have a lot of heartaches to deal with, but on the other hand, there is no shortcut to sorting through these issues. I think we are hopeful. I think this will sort itself out. It's just sometimes the most painful and the saddest question is, who will be the last person to die because of this nonsense?
Deb, with that very uplifting end that's from Abbas, let me ask you a slightly different question. We've talked about democracy, freedom of speech, use of intimidation by groups, even within sectarian identities. What role is there for the United States and the international community in improving this? I know that right now, this is not where the Biden administration's time is focused. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? In other words, what can the United States do to help Iraq develop in ways that originally we had intended on being better from 2003? And is that even us encouraging other people to do things with Iraq as opposed to us doing it directly? A number of different directions you can go.
Good, because I am completely unqualified to answer that question. However, what I did want to talk about is the legacy for the United States, from Obama's policies towards the Syrian uprising, definitely affected by what happened in Iraq. Much more interesting going forward in Ukraine, where you have pro-American Arab allies who don't want to criticize Russia because there has been a realignment of power after, and Iraq contributed to that. And I was thinking yesterday, the New York Times ran a story that said that the Department of Defense is blocking or trying to block evidence that the Biden administration wants to send to the ICC on Ukraine. That's all about Iraq. 2004, the head of the UN said that essentially the Iraq war was illegal. So the United States has had legal liability about that invasion, and their stance towards the ICC has to do with that. And so the echoes of what happened in Iraq are still playing out today, because as I understood, the Pentagon's trying to stop evidence going to the ICC, that's about Iraq. So we still are living in this post-Iraq moment.
I want to take this conversation in a different direction and go back to another part of what Marsin mentioned earlier, and I'll go to Marsin. You talked about the desire of Iraqis for greater prosperity, but I want to drill down a little bit on that. Do most young Iraqis now believe they are entitled to a government job the way that the previous generation did, or are they truly open to the development of a private sector, entrepreneurship, and the inherent risks involved in a private sector economy? How is thinking evolving among young Iraqis? My very unscientific sampling leads me to believe that many young Iraqis still would like to have a government job as opposed to start their own business, but you are much closer to it than I am.
The mentality of the public sector job is so pervasive that even growing up in the United States, my vision of my own career was that I would go to college, then I would get a job I would never leave. And, that of course changed when I got to college and realized that this is not how the work environment functioned. So I don't blame Iraqis, because I can see how I myself was socialized by this idea that the goal of an education is to go get that one job and be secure. But I will say that as I live in Baghdad and I notice protests happening from time to time on a small scale of, maybe like 2 dozen, 3 dozen individuals, it's usually outside government offices or ministries asking for employment. And this is continuing in Iraq today. Youth want to know that once they get that degree, that there is a job for them, because they saw that's what happened with their parents and their grandparents. And when they talk to their parents, they're always going on and on about how during their time, I think the story is very similar to the United States, by the way. There's such a difference in how far a dollar went in the generations prior to like the millennials, for example, in the US and versus where they are today. So there's this idea of living under much more difficult economic times. I don't think Iraqis are at all closed off to the idea of the private sector. I think it gets very much romanticized by the international community because they view it as this panacea, and it can be. But one of the things that you do need to know about the private sector is that it's very much unregulated in the way it treats employees. So Iraqi women without a doubt would prefer the public sector because there's more protections to them. Not just in terms of, maternity leave and things like that, but also in terms of issues of sexual harassment and being able to do something about it. In the private sector, that's entirely unregulated. So I think as important as it is to develop a private sector that Iraqi youth will flock to, because they just do seek respectable employment, I think it's important to build a healthy private sector that performs better than the public sector when it comes to rights, particularly for vulnerable populations, for women, especially for Iraqi women, particularly in non-urban areas, for example. Employment, lack of employment is the first driver of migration in Iraq today. If you look at causes of why individuals want to leave, it's no longer security. If you even look at minority communities, which tend to get overlooked in a lot of discussion of where Iraq is headed, obviously the entire ethno-religious map of Iraq was completely changed after 2003. Consequence of the war no one talks about, Christian population decimated. But if you look at the post-ISIS minorities that are recovering right now, they express a desire to stay in Iraq, but they're completely inhibited by the fact that there is no employment and that they're caught between various actors that are political that fail to provide them employment. So this is the problem across all of Iraq. And I can't even divide it by different groups. It's something that is pervasive throughout the country.
Well, let me make a comment on that and then see if either Deb or Abbas would like to comment. I mean, Iraq still is laboring under an evolving rentier economy where the government sells oil and then distributes that to the population. That works relatively efficiently in Kuwait or in the UAE, where you have about the same amount of revenue coming in, but a population that is 1/40th or 1/50th of the population of Iraq. I honestly believe that there is no way that the Iraqi government can sustain economic development and provide employment on its own for a million new Iraqis joining the job market every year coming soon. The question then is, what is the transition from a rentier economy, both in terms of political attitudes toward government and in terms of steps needed to make an economy that will produce a productive private sector, not a corrupted sectarian or unproductive private sector? And that may be beyond our competence. I know many have thought about it, but it strikes me as a really important issue for the future of Iraq because oil revenue will not give everybody jobs. There's got to be another alternative. So Abbas, or I don't know if you have questions on things that need to happen inside Iraq that might help that transition to a more private sector economy.
Well, it's almost like any set of steps for recovery. The first one is to acknowledge that what is going on is untenable and is unsustainable. 8 million people drawing a check from the government in a country that has no revenue to speak of other than the oil revenue, which is hardly enough to operate the state. So that's clear. And every administration adds more to that number. And when I'm talking about the 8 million, you have pensioners and you have actual active employees and you have people who are in the other social networks or safety nets that are being offered, which are really not enough to keep the dignity of the Iraqi family of an unemployed person. So it's not the right way. I think what Iraq needs is to go back to the drawing board and to change the entire policies of the state. You start with the laws. And that's why Parliament gets a pass on this, and every blame comes on the government. A lot of the problems in Iraq is that we still have laws from the 1960s and 70s and 80s on the books when Iraq was a protectionist, anti-investment, anti-free market state, and these laws are still enforced. We need to address those issues, and Parliament is very sluggish on addressing those laws and enacting new laws. Iraq also, the Iraqi government needs to have a new set of economic advisors. We need to really depart from the point that an advisor is a person in a an influential party that didn't get a ministerial job. So the person will go to become an advisor. We have an army of advisors right now for the government, and none of them, again, anybody who is close to the Iraqi government knows that these people are not doing any job. They're just sitting there and shooting the breeze. And we need to have that. We need to have fresh, a smaller group of advisors with a better qualifications and new ideas are better than the dated ideas that we have. We need also to look differently at our economy. Iraq, until now, again, you said it, it's a rentier state, and there is no planning for the future to get out of this as long as there is oil. The entire political economy of Iraq is really get the oil from underground, sell it, and pray that the prices will not go down, or no problem with the production occurs in the near future. That's not much of a political economy. So you need to have that. You need to also invest in or intervene in the right place in this vicious circle. And I think the right point of intervention is the education. It is widely quoted, even though we never had a census that is credible since 1957. We hope to have one this year or the next year. But it is widely quoted that somewhere around 50% of Iraqis are under 19. This is the population that is in school or going to be in school soon. And if you really turn that and train those people into the jobs of the future and open the gates of the country towards investment, towards international employment, give companies as many incentives to go and set shop in Iraq and employ Iraqis. Of course, you have to work on security and on other things, and stay away from the xenophobia in the Iraqi bureaucracy. The bureaucracy itself, which is too cumbersome, takes more than 3 years, probably, I'm told, to open a bank account for a foreign company. That's ridiculous. In fact, there is no word to describe it that I can't say it here. So these are the things that you need to do. But education is the right thing. We are educating people for getting a job, as Marsin was just talking about. That is not productive. Government employment is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just when piling people on jobs that push paper is the problem. The government can, and in the past, the government used to have industries. Why should we import tomato paste from Iran while we have the best tomatoes produced in Basra, and people are throwing them away because in the season you don't have enough market to sell them, or so many other things in the products, the agriculture and others. There are 4 or 5 sectors that could immediately be activated and employ this population, a young population, even though it's a burden right now on Iraq because the way it is managed and the way it is supported is wrong, but it could be turned into an opportunity rather than it's being a burden right now. And I'm sure for those who watch those issues, I remember writing a piece with Dr. Ali Allawi and Dr. Al-Khatib. We called the manifesto in 2017. We identified 20 challenges. Most of them were in the economic side and financial side, and some of those turned into the white paper during Kadhim's government, and it was a great project. In fact, I think probably helped a lot in saving Iraq from the abyss of 2020 when the country was about to go bankrupt. And I hope that the current government will build on that and stay away from just reinventing the wheel with every administration. So I believe that that's what we need to do: education, and education in the right direction. not to graduate more philosophers and I don't know literary critics, but to go into things that can produce something and that bring revenue to the nation, and in the industry and in the services and in the technology. That's where Iraq needs to really invest, and we can turn the country around, and oil will be just another augmenting revenue rather than the only revenue.
So in the couple of minutes I have left, I want to go to Marsin and Deb, and again, change the topic a little bit. I'd like to think about the future of Iraq in the world. There has been some development in the past 5 years with Iraq acting as an intermediary between Iran and Saudi Arabia, closer ties with Jordan and Egypt, more opportunities for investment in the Far East. So Marsin, how do you see Iraq's relations with the world developing? This seems to me to be one of the stronger points that Iraq has right now, given its position. So what do you think Iraq needs to do in the coming years? And then Deb, I'll have you answer that same question.
Iraq has been on a path of strengthening ties with regional states, and I think that's a positive development, particularly with the Gulf, which has really increased in the last 2 years. We recently saw the Gulf, the Arab Gulf Cup in Basra hosted there, and it was a tremendous success by all accounts. And I think it really changed perception of Iraq in the Gulf. There's more tourism in Iraq right now. Many more people coming to Baghdad, traveling through archaeological sites, etc. So I think Iraq is naturally positioned to be a mediator in the region. We are diverse, which is both a blessing and a curse, but it allows us to be an excellent bridge between various countries in the region. I also think we have had so many different historical experiences that we can find empathy with almost every kind of actor and every kind of state. And, Iraqi politicians, whether for better or worse, can probably get along with a lot of different people. But, we'll take this to our advantage. I hope these things continue. But these are actually one of the things that I do see as improving in Iraq.
And Deb gives you the last word.
Thank you. As a journalist, of course, it's hard for me to be specific, but listening to both of you and knowing what I do about Iraq, on paper, it should be a powerhouse. It has everything it needs to do so. Climate change is going to be a huge challenge for Iraq. It already is in Basra, and agriculture is going to suffer greatly because of climate change. And in the short term, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. But as I said, on paper, you have so much human capital. The question is, can you deal with corruption and sort of government stagnation in some places to be able to realize that potential? When I was interviewing people over the past couple of days, one of the experts sort of, went to the famous Chou en-lai comment about how he would assess the French Revolution. And he said, it's too early to tell. And he said, that is what you can say about Iraq. It's too early to tell whether they can somehow, realize the promise that the country has.
Well, we have run out of time. We have only begun to scratch the surface of both the problems, but the potential of Iraq. I will end by saying probably my most frequent private conversation with Iraqis when I was in Iraq was explaining to them how much potential the country has, how the historical greatness can turn Iraq into a more influential and more stable and more prosperous country in the future. And I'm hoping that what I hear from Abbas, from Marsin, that Iraqis will begin to come to that realization on their own, and in the relatively near future, begin to work together to realize that potential. So Dr. Marsin Alshamary, Ms. Deborah Amos, Dr. Abbas Kadhim, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom on Iraq. For our audience, I really appreciate your attendance. Please continue to watch us here at AGSIW and see all of our stuff at agsiw.com. So that's all for now. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye-bye.